Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatiron's Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning. Welcome back, everybody, to the Flatiron Syndicate Podcast. We are here today with another special guest. We have got Karen Bailey-Chapman from SEMA. So, Karen, if I have this right, you are the Senior Vice President of Public and Government Affairs for SEMA. Is that correct?
That's correct. Nice big long title.
Yes. And it's perfect for the topic of the day. The reason that I reached out to SEMA and yourself is that a few episodes ago, we had the guys on from Cobb Tuning. We were talking about their flex fuel system. And one of the things that came up is the fact that they were not able to get a CARB approval for the flex fuel kit, and some of the whys as far as that. And some of our very astute listeners chimed in the time to basically, between we recorded that and to now, something has happened, has come through the Supreme Court, and they have overturned something called the Chevron Deference. And the guys were like, well, this is relevant to what you guys were talking about. You need to explore this. But I'll be upfront, I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. and because it is a legal thing, I knew that I was very curious and it seemed very interesting, but I'm sure that there's a lot of levels to this. And that's where I reached out to SEMA to see if there was somebody that could help us kind of go through and figure out what does this all mean? What are the implications of this? And Karen, that's how I met you, and you agreed to come on, which is fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Now, and just right at the front, Karen, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what SEMA does, because knowing that this was a governmental change in a legal something that had legal implications to the automotive aftermarket, the first thing that I thought of was to reach out to SEMA. But I think a lot of people that are listening that maybe just think of SEMA as just the show and that's it. Maybe they don't realize some of the other, like really the majority of what SEMA does. So could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, everybody knows us by our show, which is obviously extraordinary and now the largest in Las Vegas. But yeah, we do stuff actually 361 other days of the year other than our 4 show days. And so one of those big components is our government relations program and our advocacy program, advocating on behalf of the specialty automotive aftermarket. We have a team in DC as well as one person in California, a team of 9 right now that focus on government regulatory issues and legislative issues, both in Washington, D.C. and the state capitol year round.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you guys kind of are a voice for the automotive aftermarket with government agencies in the like.
Exactly.
Okay. Because I think maybe some people did not realize that was one of the things that you do. And I definitely know that there's some enthusiasts kind of feel like we don't have a voice. Mm-hmm. If they wanted to kind of reach out to SEMA and try and support you guys in what you do, what would be, a way that you'd recommend? What's the best way to do that?
So I would say if you're looking to keep up with the latest legislative issues and being able to take action and see what's going on in the state and federal legislatures, is to go to the SEMA Action Network, which is semasan.com. You can sign up, it's free, and we'll keep you abreast of what's going on in your state as well as what's going on federally. But then also, if you're just looking at want to know about some of the issues that we work on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot. You can go to SEMA.org/advocacy, and there's a ton of information in there on the various issues that we tackle each and every day on behalf of the industry.
Okay. And I will put links to those in the description here. So if people want to click on those and see what you guys are doing and mm-hmm. how much more involved you guys are with everything that's going on out here that we're all working through, that'd be a great way to find out.
Absolutely.
Okay. So with that said, let's talk about this Chevron Deference. What is kind of your initial thought when this happened? What is the initial thought of what the implications of this are?
Sure. I mean, before I get into that, there's everyone in the organization's heard me say this because it's kind of my tagline these days, and that is, at the end of the day, the law is still the law. So there are still EPA standards. There's still Clean Air Act laws that we still have to comply with when it comes to emissions. So the law is still the law. But what the Chevron deference is and sort of why this was such an important decision out of the US Supreme Court is the fact that it overturned 40 years of precedents. So when, the courts, especially the high courts, make a decision, it now sets precedent and sort of based on how we do the law in this country. And so what it does is, so what's been allowed over the past 40 plus years is the fact that if the law that Congress passes is ambiguous or silent, that the courts were required, because of the Chevron decision 40 plus years ago, if the law was silent or ambiguous and the federal agency sort of filled in the blank or interpreted it as what they felt was the interpretation, the courts were essentially required to give deference to the federal agencies. And so, so I think we've sort of seen some of this within our industry over the past several years, particularly in the emissions compliance space. And so what this does is really return power back to the way our government's been set up. Congress makes the laws, the judiciary interprets the laws, and the federal agencies implement the laws. So this takes it back to the court saying, okay, the courts now have to interpret the laws based on what's actually written. They can still take the opinion of the federal agency. They can still listen to them because they'll have an opinion, just like we would on our end of this, on our end of any kind of litigation. But it really returns that power back to the courts interpreting exactly what the law says.
Okay. And like with the Clean Air Act, I mean, I think, most anybody that especially works in the automotive aftermarket or enthusiasts that were participating in the automotive aftermarket, they probably sensed that change that happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago, like you were saying, where things, it's like the interpretation of the Clean Air Act was interpreted in a different way. And so then all of a sudden companies started to find out that, okay, well, these things that you thought were okay are now no longer okay. But that was based on just some kind of a change in interpretation.
It could be.
Yeah,
it could be. I can't speak to obviously any specific litigation or
Sure.
decisions that were made previously. But I think where this is probably most applicable currently is actually on the tailpipe emission standards that the
Okay.
EPA has passed. That's now going into litigation, in the federal court system. So it's actually going forward is going to be, I think, helpful for our industry, especially those impacted on with internal combustion engine bans. So I think, that's if we want to kind of look at the best sort of silver lining about this and the greatest opportunity, it's in the go forward in terms of how the courts have to look at what is and isn't allowed in the law.
And I guess it brings the courts right back in. The courts are now in the center, and so a decision now has to go through the courts, and the judge has the authority to make the decision. Whereas before, like, I guess what I was trying to get at is if there's a change in interpretation of something from a federal agency, then basically that became the standard. Whereas now the courts are now right there in the center of that and involved in it.
Correct.
Okay. And one of the top questions I had is, how broad is this? I mean, is this kind of very, very, like, it could potentially interact with or affect any of the policies that a government agency has, like you're saying with tailpipe emissions, or is this going to be kind of something that's more small scale?
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this case is the fact that this case was actually the case that led to the overturn of the Chevron doctrine was actually a case against the Commerce Department. So it had nothing to do with the EPA.
Okay.
And so it is actually pretty far-reaching. I know of several friends in other industries that are actually looking at what the overturn of Chevron is actually going to do for them in terms of actions that have been taken against them by federal agencies. But it's not just the EPA, it's across the board,
Right.
for all federal agencies.
That's a good point. Yeah, this is not, the decision was not specific to the EPA at all. It was to federal agencies.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So with the tailpipe emissions, I mean, what is your kind of hope or your thought about, like, how those changes are going to be addressed, or maybe what some of the movements through the courts are starting to look like?
Sure. So there's already been challenges in the court systems, both with specifically with ACC1, which was California's emission standards, sort of the first set that go up to model year 26. And then, of course, we've got ACC2, which is the second set of emission standards that California has put forward, which is the ban of the internal 100% ban of the internal combustion engine, because that does require the EPA to provide a waiver, and that's something that was written into the Clean Air Act several decades ago. So anyway, I think what you're going to see at the forefront of the conversation here is with regards to the case of EV mandates and or ICE bans is the fact that that the EPA doesn't have the authority to dictate the technology. They can't say we can only have one technology over the other, or only this technology and none of the others. So I think that's really going to be sort of what you see at the forefront. I actually just had an article come across my desk this morning with respect to some current litigation that's in process for emission standards as well as fuel economy standards, and it's sitting in the DC Circuit Court, which is the first level of court you go through when you challenge a federal agency's action. That court has actually already said back to the parties, both the plaintiff as well as the defendant in that case, to say, we need you to rebrief this case because of the change in the Chevron decision. So we're only, 3 weeks from that decision having been made by the Supreme Court, on this issue. So we're already seeing in like the DC Circuit Court saying, okay, the parties need to now look at it through this lens, and you need to tell us more. And then, of course, then it'll continue its way through the court systems.
Okay. And one of the other questions, and maybe you've kind of answered this, but I want to get to it, is this going to focus mainly on things at the state level, or is it mainly at a federal level, or could it potentially be both state and federal level?
I think primarily this is a federal decision, but the Supreme Court is the land, law of the land. So we've seen obviously a number of different state laws that have been challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court across a number of different issues, not well beyond the automotive industry and emissions. So it will have a certain applicability, I think, going forward, especially as cases reach into the federal court systems. But I think primarily and on the front end and sort of where we are from an opportunity standpoint is really on these federal agency actions.
It would seem to me from an industry standpoint, working at a federal level so that it's more of a blanket to all of the states is going to be easier or more beneficial. Because one of the things that we've run into, so we're in Colorado, and we're one of the states that now has requires carb-approved catalytic converters. And for us, so we are a retailer, so we sell these parts, but then that's been a little bit more challenging for us with these parts in particular, because we can't sell them in our own state, we can't sell them in California, we can't sell them in New York State, and there's a few other states that are coming online with that requirement. And so then that, when you have that kind of a requirement on a per state level for a specific type of part or genre of part, then that for a retailer, that makes it a little bit more challenging, because it's a little bit more of a checkerboard where you have to figure out, well, this is where it's okay, this is where it's not okay.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly where, again, where the challenges are. And the EPA hasn't issued the waiver to California for ACC2. So, as I mentioned, ACC1's already going through the court systems, but with ACC2, I think that's really where some of the legal challenges are going to happen, is the fact that when the Clean Air Act was enacted, when it was created as a law, it did give a carve out for California to set its own emission standards, because it did. Actually, their emission standards predated the federal laws. They also had some unique challenges with their geography and, of course, the harbors and shipping ports and whatnot. But yeah, there definitely is a question in terms of the fact that we've got now 16 other states. It used to be 17. Virginia repealed itself from following California standards. So good job with Governor Youngkin. Really appreciate him doing what he did. But the fact is that, there is a question over, well, these 16 states aren't technically, in our opinion, would say that they're not technically allowed to sit there and implement the California emission standards, to your point, because then you start to get into questions about interstate commerce and interruption of that and so forth. So I think you'll certainly see, should these be taken to court, which I expect they will, those questions come up and determine.
So this could, even just with that specific issue, this could possibly open the door for in those individual states for it to move through their individual states court system to see if the state's legal system upholds that standard or not?
There's a couple of different pathways, I would say.
Okay,
So there's a challenge within the states that can be made of saying you aren't allowed to do this. Um, but really, this goes into the federal system because, again, the way the Clean Air Act was written is the fact that California had their carve out for the reasons I gave, and the fact is that EPA, you have to be compliant with
right.
EPA emission standards for the other 49 states. So again, that's sort of where it gets a little hanky. But the fact is that at the end of the day, the Clean Air Act says EPA is federal. We give a little special carve out for California. But quite frankly, if you're compliant with EPA standards in the other 49 states, then you should be legal.
Gotcha. One of the things that this makes me wonder is if one of the results of this, or one of the things that could come out of this, is that they're going to have to go back and kind of clarify a lot of the things that they frankly probably just didn't even know about or think of when they wrote the initial Clean Air Act, to kind of clarify what the purpose of that is. I mean, do you think a revision of the Clean Air Act is one of the things that could eventually come out of all this?
Potentially. I mean, I think politically, regardless of which side of the aisle people sit on, whether you're Republican or Democrat or somewhere in between, that's always been a challenging piece of legislation to reconsider. But to your point is the fact that that was written in the 70s. Technology has changed significantly. The technologies that we're all exploring, whether it is EVs, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's, even just applications within our engine systems like superchargers and all of that kind of stuff, we've had a pretty significant change in technology. So I don't want to speculate because I do know that, when it comes to the Clean Air Act, that tends to be sort of a political hot button piece of
Sure.
law. But it's something that I think you'll start to see, maybe some questions around, or future legislation that sort of addresses some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's that ambiguousness that has been the challenge up to this point. And so now I guess I don't know if you'd agree, but maybe one of the better, more positive sides of this is that ambiguousness in the law can now be addressed as on a per case basis or as needed.
Exactly. It returns the balance of power into Congress makes the laws, judiciary interprets the laws, the federal agencies implement the laws.
Right.
But it takes that power away from the federal agencies to kind of, again, fill in the blanks, sort of that Mad Libs kind of style of regulation, and return it back into the courts. Now, look, federal agencies can still regulate, right? It's not taking the power of regulation away, but it's just saying they cannot fill in the blanks where there's a question within the law or the law is silent.
Yeah, and I think that opportunity to get that clarification, that's probably the what is the most encouraging about this, is that now it opens the conversation, because I think one of the biggest problems to this point has been when there's an interpretation that comes down that affects some part of the industry basically has had no choice but to comply with that interpretation, and there's no conversation, it's not two ways, it's a one-way enforcement of it. And so now this is kind of a two-way. You at least have the opportunity for the discussion to be had.
Yeah, you have the opportunity for the discussion to be had, because, again, the courts are no longer required to give deference to the federal agency and how they feel it should be. They can certainly take their opinion, right? They're going to take their opinion just like they would take our opinion, those of us on our side of the issue. But the fact is that they no longer have to give deference. And I think one of the other interesting things, sort of one of the less known court cases that came out actually a couple of days before the Chevron decision came out, or the overturn of Chevron came out, was actually a case against the SEC, which also eliminated, if you will, maybe I shouldn't use such a strong word, but basically said that the federal agencies can know, and I'm using my own words, not the legalese, is that the federal agencies can no longer act as sort of judge, jury, and executioner. So it was, like I said, it was a case against the SEC where the agency enforced against somebody, and then an internal court essentially decided whether the person was in the wrong or in the right. Obviously said in the wrong, and then handed out the judgment and the penalty. And so that previous case against the SEC, I think, is also going to be impactful impactful for our industry as it relates to how these enforcement actions are taken, and then requiring it again to go back into the court, so that there's a versus sort of being handed a piece of paper saying sign here or else. And
Right. You have any manufacturer or business has more of an opportunity to kind of say their side, get the courts involved to make sure that the courts say that it's a fair decision in
right.
whatever direction.
And look, I still think that, well, not that I think, from a SEMA perspective, is that compliance is still your friend. If you're a manufacturer of these parts and or retailer, because this has been this has been acted against at several different parts of our supply chain and distribution network, is the fact that compliance is still your best friend. And so, being compliant, if you're going to sell in California, you get your CARB EO. If you're going to sell outside of California, make sure you're compliant under the EPA. That's something the SEMA Garage helps our members with, and something that, again, at the end of the day, it's going to be your best defense if an agency comes knocking on your door.
Could you talk a little bit more about what the SEMA Garage is doing, and basically maybe like why you guys started the SEMA Garage, and then what the SEMA Garage is doing?
Sure. I mean, the SEMA Garage was created because of sort of the increasing enforcement and oversight of compliance within our industry. We saw a great need. This obviously predated my joining SEMA, but something that really we invested in order for our members to have the ability to go and ask questions, but then also go through the compliance process. So if you're SEMA certified, you should be good in 49 states. If you are wanting to sell in California, then we assist you with your CARB EO application, as well as the testing. So we are certified, to do that work with CARB, for CARB, on behalf of our members. So we help you from the testing phase throughout the application phase. So it was a huge investment by SEMA to do this, for the membership, because not every manufacturer is big enough to have their own testing facilities or to invest in the private, sort of what's available in the private sector. And in addition to that, not applicable to today's conversation, but we also, in our Detroit, we have two garages, by the way, California and Detroit. Our Detroit garage also has ADAS testing, which is your advanced driver safety systems testing, as in addition to emissions. So not applicable for today, but as vehicle technology is continuing to advance with all of the requirements that we expect to come down from NHTSA, which is Highway Transportation Safety Administration. We also have those facilities to start testing out tolerances for things like lifts, lowering, and other modifications to vehicles.
So, and again, two testing facilities that can duplicate the kind of testing that CARB was doing. So basically you're giving two other options for a manufacturer to go through and test and get a certification, if not possibly lead to a CARB certification for a part, to show
Correct.
that it meets all these standards.
Exactly. So we actually, SEMA members and the work that's come through the SEMA Garage on our compliance side, we actually account for about half of the CARB EOs that are issued for the aftermarket to date.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of members that are using it, and encourage others that aren't familiar with it is to take a look, give a call, and like our garage guys will answer, even if you just have a basic question. They'll answer your questions and help you through and navigating some of these issues.
And having that other path to do the testing, get the certification, to find out if your part is compliant, whatnot. That was a big deal when you guys did that. I don't know that a lot of people who are watching would know that you guys had done it, but I definitely want to make sure that we talked about it a little bit.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. To that end, one of the interesting parts, as we're recording this, is 2024. Technology, like what we now know about the internal combustion engine, how it works, the technology that we can apply to an engine and how it works. It's on a whole nother level than it was probably even 10 years ago, much less 40. But one of the challenges has been, I think, that getting that certification or being able to have that conversation with some of these agencies that have these standards to show, like, hey, look at what we can do. They haven't wanted to have those conversations.
Yeah.
Do you think that, like, being able to test something in a SEMA Garage and now having this kind of open the door to a legal path to have kind of that conversation to show what the aftermarket can now possibly do, and how they can produce a part that maybe is compliant, but that wouldn't have fit underneath the rule of the law before. Like, is that one of the biggest positives to this, do you think, for the
Well,
automotive world?
I think it's honestly just a fundamental way that we just even look at sort of the two parties, sort of the regulators who may be resistant to accepting the things that our industry does, especially in the performance sector. You know, I always like to say we're we're specialists in doing more with less.
Right.
You know, and so the fact is, you know, I think there's going to always be a fundamental push and pull between what we believe should be. So doing less with more, improving that, and continuing to, you know, again, achieve emission standards and clean air and clean water and all of that kind of stuff. But not because we're told we can only use one technology over the other, because there's so much innovation that's happening, even with the internal combustion engine. I was actually in an interview with a different outlet a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions was, "Do you remember your first V8 that you ever, you know, or drove in or heard or whatever?" And I was like, I was trying to think back. I was like, well, I think my cousin's 1981 Corvette was it, because he used to come pick my mom or me up for lunch when I was
Mhm.
little, like really, really little, before I even kind of understood the difference between cars. And I was kind of looking up, I'm like, I think it was a V8. And I kind of looked it up and I was like, wow, it topped out at 140 horsepower. But yet you look at what the technology is today, and whether you're a V8, V6, or even four, quite frankly, and the amount of power we're able to get out of technology today versus, again, an 81 Corvette, that
A little
still a
different.
V8.
Yeah.
Still
Yeah.
a V8.
Well,
a
and we're able
little
to,
tiny.
but we're also able to achieve way more power, but also keep the emissions down. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so I think, again, it goes back to the fundamental push and pull. You know, look, it was really disappointing this year. We actually, SEMA led an effort in California to do a level playing field, where we, you know, right now in California, if you go and you buy a new EV, you're eligible for a rebate. So we said, well, if your goal is to, you know, help reduce emissions, transition to new technologies, but also still have the ability of things like recyclability. You know, you think about all our cars that are on the roads today, and so we think that anybody that wants to convert to a zero emissions vehicle should have the same access to this kind of a rebate. I mean, if all is fair and fair, and it passed through the legislature unanimously, not a single no vote went through the legislature, but the governor still vetoed it. So, you know, that goes back to that fundamental question. I was like, well, what are we truly going after here? And what is it that we want to accomplish? Because there's a lot of different ways for us to get to lower emissions while still maintaining our ability to modify, to still have power, still do the cool stuff that we all like to do, and who the consumers that we serve also, or that our companies sell to, ultimately want to have.
Yeah. I remember when a lot of these changes started coming through, and what was possible and what was known to be possible, it's kind of like it felt like things were getting taken away.
Mhm.
But fortunately, I've been in the automotive aftermarket long enough to know you never count against the aftermarket, because there's so many smart, ingenuitive people out there that they're going to look at these new restrictions, new issues. They're going to have a think on it, and they're going to come up with an idea, and they're going to try something, and they're going to find a new way to do something that
Mhm.
actually works with these new restrictions. And that's what we're seeing now. It took a year, 18 months or something like that. But all of a sudden, these new technologies, new approaches are starting to come out. And what I'm most encouraged by here is that if somebody comes up with one of these ideas and they find it, and they can now take it to the SEMA Garage and prove that it works,
Mhm.
now there's a real chance, real likelihood that they can actually test it, vet it, and then they have the opportunity to have that conversation with the agency through the legal system to make it a reality, so that we can all keep doing what we want to do.
Exactly. You know, never underestimate the power of the innovation in the automotive aftermarket. It's one of my favorite things to talk about with lawmakers, and um, you know, about the fact that we always find a way. All right, again, do more with less, more power with less engine, and all of the different things that we do. But I think the other part too is the cautionary tale is the fact that, I think there's some people within the automotive aftermarket that say, oh, well, that's just the emissions, guys. People that do, touch performance, touch the engine, touch emissions. It's not my problem. But the thing is that now we're seeing a move within CARB, as well as from a federal perspective, is starting to look at tire emissions.
Hmm.
Okay, so if you do X, Y, and Z, what does it do to tire emissions? And then, sort of, so we see that as sort of the next, piece of this puzzle, because it's not going to just stop with tailpipes. It's going to continue on with other elements of the vehicle, and sort of tires are squarely in their path right now.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit about that, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because you have to roll on 4 tires, or at least maybe
Right.
3. There's really
Exactly.
not a whole lot of options there. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to follow.
Yeah.
From an industry standpoint, the one wonder that I have here, like, I think there's a huge opportunity for these new technologies, new approaches to now
Mm-hmm.
be vetted. But do you think that there's a risk that this makes things more variable? Because one of the hardest parts for my side of the industry, being a retailer, was having to kind of pivot when a change came through.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been at this for almost 20 years, and this is kind of like the first really big pivot. And now it seems like maybe things are going to change and maybe go back a little bit, like halfway to where they were, or something like that. But now that you can have this legal conversation whenever there's grounds for it, it kind of makes me wonder, is there a possibility that there's going to be a lot more shifting, like every, say, 4 or 5 years, give or take?
Well, I think the one thing that the Chevron decision, or overturn of the Chevron decision, doesn't do is change the political conversation that's happening in our
Sure,
country. So
sure.
we've obviously seen that sort of oscillate, depending on which party wins the White House. It's playing out. I mean, look, the issue over ICE bans and EV mandates is at the forefront of the presidential election right now, one of the top issues. And so outside of the legal system, you also have the political system, and sort of what is that going to do? So I think we'll see obviously what comes out of the November elections. But I think that's always, as somebody who's spent her career over 20 years navigating the political system, is always trying to find that sort of middle line, as sort of the world sits there and does this in the system, because Congress changes every 2 years, the president may change every 4 years,
Yeah.
is to kind of try to find that happy medium. Sorry, I use my hands a lot,
Yeah.
to find that middle
Yep.
ground, to kind of keep it as stable as possible, so that we can kind of keep moving along, so that we're able to provide us, to create as much of a stable environment for ourselves, and navigate that what's really a politically divisive environment that we're working in today.
Do you think it's possible? It seems like it's possible to me that the testing, like getting the certified result, like what you can do through SEMA Garage, could be
Mhm.
one of the keys to kind of get a little bit more of a consistent through road to changes that could come up. Because having, like, when you come up with a product and you say, well, this works and it does X, Y, or Z, or it doesn't emit more than whatever, just saying that is one thing. But if you actually have the test results to show it, and you can continually get consistent results to show that there's this consistent effect where um, it's meeting these standards time and time again, like, do you think that might be one of the keys that we as the automotive aftermarket need to keep in mind, so that we have that stability that we kind of want, so that we can sleep better at night?
Exactly. I mean, I think again, I go back to the law is still the law, and so compliance is still going to be your best friend, when it comes to, if you are challenged by a federal agency or even by California. But if you have if you have CARB-EO, you should be good.
Yeah.
But if you are challenged by the federal agency, to have that compliance work done and the testing done, and that the retailers and distributors are distributing appropriately, then that's going to be your best defense if somebody comes knocking on your door questioning the practices and the manufacturing of the part.
Yeah. It is a new world, and I don't know. It's just I want to get excited about this, and I think there's a lot to be excited about here. But I think we kind of have to measure with, like, well, what do we want? Like, you kind of have to have like a 4 or 5 year viewpoint down the road, and like, okay, well, how can we use this to make sure that we get the direction that we're going, but we can also stay on that trajectory versus just kind of make a big jump. So maybe it seems like maybe this is going to be a slower process than some people might think at the outset. Like this is not going to be something where it's an overnight flip of the switch in a lot of different directions.
Right. Yeah. I think one thing is that, we just have to keep in mind is that government works slow. But that's actually how it's designed, right? The court systems work slow. That's how it's designed because we've obviously felt just from an industry perspective, when a political wind shifts and somebody makes a decision, how disruptive that is, right? And so our system of government is intended to be slow. And that's actually where the whole question of executive power, you see with White Houses deciding, and it's in both parties, it's not just one over the other, making executive orders for federal agencies to act in X, Y, or Z because Congress is too slow. Well, that's the way it was designed. And so, I think that's the thing that is important is that, for people to keep in mind is the fact that, that's what that's why our government's designed it as
Right.
it is. As frustrating as it can be, it is the way it's designed.
Yeah. And in some ways, the benefit of that is it does make that when we have to pivot, it slows down like the pivot, and hopefully we can kind of see it coming a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe not always, but sometimes.
Well, and I think again, it's sort of again, I love working with our garage team because they're the ones that are able to provide data. At the end of the day, this is data driven. It's not, we want to get the touchy feely out. Well, I feel this way,
Yeah.
even in politics, I always say to my team, when we're trying to sort of understand voter sentiment, my question's always, do we think this is how people feel, or do we know it, right? And so in my world, I do polling. I find out what voters are thinking, how they feel about issues, or how they react to messaging or issues that we bring to them, and it's really no different than when you're testing, obviously, albeit more scientific than polling, but scientific. And so data is certainly helpful. And again, whether you're talking on emissions compliance and how you use the parts within an emission system, or even again going back to the safety stuff that's coming down the pike, is sort of having that data to sort of help understand and also contextualize, for the average American, what's going on. Because that's the other part of it too, is that I think our industry, when people know who we are, people respond to us. We have a lot of credibility. We also have a lot of really strong voices. This is a really passionate industry, but we also have a very passionate consumer group, because that's who buys our parts. And so I think that's something that's really important. So I think we always want to kind of look at, how are we going to be perceived from a public perspective, and also how to have the data available so that we can make that case, should the conversation go to the public.
Yeah, that having the testing and having the data, I think is which now that more and more of the industry has the ability to do that, that gives us so much more of a basis for the conversation. Because like I said, it doesn't seem like we're still selling snake oil here. Like we can go to the testing, we can go to the results, we can go to the data and say, like, this is what we can do. Like this is what is possible. And I think, that's a whole different side of a conversation, because that kind of, it's your foot in the door. Like,
Exactly.
no, we can modify an engine, we can make this much power, and it can be emissions compliant. And I'm not just saying that. Here's a car, here's multiple cars, we've done it, here's the proof, here's the test result. This is possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So now, as we're kind of winding down here, I want to ask, because you mentioned like tires, you mentioned like autonomous driving testing and some other safety standards. If you took a look 2 years down the road, what are some of the other things you think us as enthusiasts we should kind of have on our radar, be paying attention to for things, either new standards that are coming in or other things that are kind of moving through that we should kind of keep our ears open about?
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, the advanced driver safety systems is really going to be the next frontier, because you've already got the NTSB, who's going to be regulating things like It's actually already in process, which is the automatic emergency braking systems in vehicles. I'm an off-roader, so that's
Mhm.
obviously something that, how does that work from an off-road perspective when you take the vehicle that you drive on the street and then take it off-road, and how does that all work? But everything from the lane departure systems and all of the other bells and whistles that are being put on vehicles today and will be as they go forward, and especially as they become mandated. How does that interact with our industry? And quite frankly, when we modify a vehicle, it doesn't matter if you're in the off-road or on the performance side, you want it to be safe.
Yeah.
So we need to have the tools and the access to the systems to be able to do those proper calibrations. If you change out of bumper, if you lower the vehicle, if you lift the vehicle, what are all the tolerances? And then how do we recalibrate the sensors that are responsible for these safety systems so that we can operate our vehicles safely, or ultimately our consumers' vehicles safely? And so that's, I think, probably one of the big ones that's coming down the pike that, I don't think it's going to be sort of as political, if you will, as sort of what's happened in the ICE and EV mandate issues, ICE ban, EV mandate issues. But this is something that I think we want to be mindful of. Again, going back to the testing part of it, and really, a desire for us to be able to work with our OE partners to get that information and to understand, again, what do we need to do and have access into the system so that we can calibrate appropriately, and understand the tolerances for the vehicles as we modify them.
Yeah, and getting that access, I think that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah.
I've heard also something about maybe different encryption standards for ECUs themselves, where it might actually be less and less possible to get into a factory ECU to modify it in any
Mhm.
way. Do you know, can you speak to
Yeah,
that at all?
I can't speak to, you know, any standards. I think actually one of the things that from our perspective is that we'd like to see some standardization of standards, if you
Okay,
will.
yeah,
Even with how safety systems operate. Sorry, I'm going back to the safety systems part of
yeah,
it versus just the ECU, but how the safety system operates, it's all different standards right now. And so it's like, okay, well, if this is what we're going to do and we're going in these systems will be mandated, then what are the standards in which we're all operating off of? Sort of like if you think, sorry, I'm going to go back to an EV example, but if you
yeah,
think about, GM's EV was powered differently, had a different portal than the Tesla. Obviously, Tesla was sort of the first one to build out its infrastructure, which is different than other OEs, right? We saw sort of that turmoil that happened, or that is happening within the infrastructure debate. So sort of let's take that and sort of apply that same question to safety systems, saying, okay, so if we're going to have standards of safety systems that have to be implemented, what are the standards? What's the equipment we're using, so that it sets, sort of a cross industry type standard that everybody can
yeah. And
adapt to. Excuse me.
well, and especially now because so many of these safety systems are based on computers, programming, sensors,
Yeah.
electronics. If every manufacturer is using a different system or different set of sensors, or like they probably at this point all have their own separate programming, but
Mhm.
then that's a big challenge for the automotive aftermarket, because that's a whole lot of computer code that you're going to have to sort out and figure out how to interact with for every different car that you want to go in there and try and figure out a way to work with the safety systems and preserve the function of the safety
Right.
systems.
Yeah, that's where I sort of lay some hope with partnerships with our OEs, in being able to do that. But then I think there's some opportunity within the regulatory environment is to saying, okay, look, consumers are still going to modify their vehicles. So we can
Yeah,
either sort of, cover our eyes up, stick our head in the sand, or, along with regulators saying, how do we do this so that people are operating their vehicles safely? So I think that's going to be, I hopefully a productive conversation and a productive outcome, as we sort of delve into that issue area.
sure. You said OEs, it just made me think of this question. Are OEs very willing to kind of have these conversations with aftermarket companies, or are they, in your experience, are they more likely to kind of wall off the aftermarket and not want to have the conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a really company by company kind of question. We certainly have them in the aftermarket. We've got tier one suppliers of people that have become, private label suppliers to the OEs, and so I think so. There's certain parts of the industry that have that relationship and are working with them with the OEs. We obviously, again, through SEMA Garage, we have different measuring systems, CAD data systems, or sharing CAD data and sort of the design work. But I guess I tend to be an optimist in the fact that I think, again, I think there's an opportunity to work with them down the road, and I certainly hope that continue. I hope that becomes the case because at the end of the day, we really want to be able to, when we're modifying our vehicles, especially when it comes to safety systems, is that we want to be able to operate the vehicle safely. So when we
Yeah.
modify, how is that vehicle behaving? How are the sensors behaving? And making sure everything's working appropriately.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think sometimes the OEs can overlook the importance of working with the enthusiast base. Keep the people that are excited about your vehicles excited about your vehicles, because not only because of what they can do off of the assembly line or the showroom floor, but what that enthusiast can do with it with the aftermarket's help down the road versus like ignoring that side of things.
Exactly. I mean, we see, if you've been to the SEMA show, you have people that kind of, if you will, rate and this is, again, the membership is not
Yeah.
SEMA, but sort of like, well, how modifiable is a certain vehicle coming off the assembly line? And so that really, we believe that there is a direct impact, is that if you're not modify friendly, people are going to go to your competitor who may be more open to that, to those opportunities. And you see that on the SEMA show floor, especially with some of the OE displays and sort of what they're demonstrating to the attendees and sort of where they're going. So again, I think there is a competitive advantage for segments of the industry of the OE side to have
Those
a good
conversations.
opportunity to modify. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Brilliant. Well, Karen, thank you again so much for setting aside the time and coming on and having this conversation. This is a tough one, and I am so glad I did not have to navigate this on my own. You've been awesome. Of
Thanks, John. I appreciate the time and look forward to talking to you again.
Nope.
course.
Thanks
Well,
again.
thanks. Yeah, thanks everybody at home for listening. Thanks for your support as always. And until next time,
Yeah,
stay tuned to the Flatirons
absolutely.
Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatironstuning.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.